Hello class. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use two-dimensional array. And the best way to learn how to use dimensional array is by looking at an application of what it is used for. And then we also look at the code, how we manipulate or access or store elements into two-dimensional array. I assume you already know one-dimensional array by looking at watching other video. So in this video, I'm gonna concentrate only on two-dimensional array. So let's say I have an application, and in my application, I want to keep track of the test score of 3 students. So I have 3 students, and each student take 2 tests. So I need a way to keep track of the test for each of this student. So I'm gonna call the student number 1, student 2, student 3. You know, in real life, you're gonna have a student name, right? But in this example, I just call them student 1, 2, 3. And each student take 2 tests, so I call it test number 1 and test number 2. You can imagine two-dimensional array is like your spreadsheet. So you look at the data representation, it looks like row and column. And that's exactly how two-dimensional array looks like. So I have 3 students. Student 1 is stored at index 0. So I call them row and column. So the number of row represent the number of students. So I have 3 students, so I have 3 rows, and the rows start from row 0, row 1, and row 2. And each student take 2 tests. So I call the test columns. So how many columns do I have? I have 2 tests, so I have 2 columns. And also the column index start from 0 and 1. You know, similar to one-dimensional array, your index will always start from 0, right? So in order to store test number 1 for the first student, I need to start on row 0 and on column 0. So the index is 0, 0. The first number in the index is the row number. The second number in the index is the column number. And if you look at this table, let's say test number 1, the student number 1 get 85 is the score for test number 1. Test number 2, he gets 95. So how do I store test number 2 for student number 1? That is stored on the same row. It's also row 0, which belongs to student number 1. And this is test number 2, so I'm going to use index 1. So the indexes to access this test score is 0 and 1, and the score is 95. Similarly, for student number 2, I'm going to use row number 1 to store the 2 tests for student number 2. The first test, he gets 78. And similar to the other student, the index of this test is row number 1, column number 0. The second test, he gets 100. The index is row 0, row 1, and then column 1. Similarly for student number 3. So that's what the table looks like. And when you look at it and you say, wow, okay, that's easy to understand. But how is this table stored in memory? So in memory, you don't really have 2 dimension in memory. You know, I'm sure you learn one-dimensional array. The elements of the array are stored contiguously in memory. That means you start storing the first element, the second, the third, and so on. So memory is linear. It's not two-dimensional like this, right? So in memory, this is how what it looks like. The first score that belong to student one, that 85, is stored in the first cell of this memory, the starting memory address of this table. The second one is the test score of student one is stored in the next cell in the memory. So what is this? Well, you may want to say, how do you call this memory layout, or how do you store this table in memory? It's called row major or storing by row. That means you start storing row zero first, and then after you finish storing all elements in row zero, you start storing element in row one, and so on. So you see the score 78 here comes after the last test score of row one. So from here, we map into a linear memory layout that look like this. So that's how the score or how the table is stored in memory. So let's say how we write code to do all this. It's easy to see the layout, the drawing, but this is a programming class, so you may wonder, how do I write code to do this? So let's look at an example how we do this. So this is my example. It's called two-dimensional, right? I uploaded this example in Canvas, so you should be able to download and run it for yourself. So I declare two constants. Constant number one represents the number of students. I have 3 students. So I store, initialize number of students to 3, have to test. My test constant is 2. And we also will look at functions, how you pass two-dimensional array to function. But before we look at a function, let's look at how you declare this array and how you store element into this array first. The way you declare this array is similar to one-dimensional array, right? I call it test score. And I told you I have 3 students and 2 tests. So the way we declare is the number of rows, the number of columns. So row comes first, then column comes second. And you notice that in one-dimensional array, you only have one pair of bracket, that's it. But two-dimensional array, you have 2 pair of brackets. So that's how we declare the array. Now, how do you store the score into this two-dimensional array? So for two-dimensional array, you need 2 loops. The outer loop, I call it the row loop. So the outer loop will loop through the number of students. And then for each student, I have 2 tests, right? So I need another loop to ask or to take the input of the 2 tests. So that's why I need 2 loops. The outer loop take care of number of rows, that number of students. The inner loop will loop through the number of tests. And the way we store into each element or each cell in this two-dimensional array is you use a 2-index row and column. So let's see, I'm going to run this code and then you will see what the output look like. And I also want to reference back to the screen so that I want to make sure I enter that test score that correspond to what I type on the slide to make it easy to understand. So let's run. Oops, I need a way to move this window around so I can run this code. Okay, so I'm gonna say run without debugging. I just want to run the code. All right. So I'm gonna move this window down here so that you can see the code right here. Right now, I am in here in this loop. You see, this is enter score for student number 1. You see that our index start from 0, but I cannot tell the user start, enter for test 0. It looks weird, so I'm going to use column plus 1 and row plus 1 to make it easy for the user to see, right? But internally, the index start from 0. So the inner loop say enter score for test number 1 for student number 1. According to my slide, that's 85, right? And then the code asks for the score for test number 2, that's 95. And we are still entering test for student 1. After the 2 score, that means I finished the inner loop. So I already finished this, column is the condition is column less than test, and my test is 2. So the index in here only goes from 0 to 1. And then when column becomes 2, I exit the inner loop. So that's why you see over here, after I enter score for test number 2, the code finished the inner loop. So where does it go? It goes back to the outer loop. Now we increment the row by 1. So now we're going to enter the score for student number 2, right? So for the student number 2, what are the test score? 78 and 100. So I'm going to enter exactly what I enter on the slide. Similar to the other student, we finished the 2 score for student number 2. Now we're going to enter test score for student number 3. And I'm using the data from the slide. So this is 98. This is 67. And if I hit enter, do you know whether we're gonna go for one more time, or if we finish enter or the score? Why don't you pause the video and then try to think whether we should go for more iteration of loop, or we finished and then you go back and then you see the result. Okay, so I hit enter, and obviously that's all, right? Because my number of students is 3 and number of tests is 2, so I already entered all of them. So now let's take a look at the code, how you print them. You see these, I enter the score, you see the upper part of the screen, and now the this part of the screen, I'm using a loop in the main program or the main function to print. So let's go to this loop to see how we print it. Surprisingly, this loop, I also need 2 nested loops. And there's no surprise. They are almost the same as the first loop where I ask the user to enter the score. The only difference right now is I have some code that make adjustment on the output to make it look nice. Other than that, the only major difference is instead of do in to read the score, now I do out to print the score, to output the score. And you see the variable I'm using, it's still test score, go by row and column. So this line 47 is almost identical as line 33, right? But line 33, we read the input from the user. Line 34, we output what we store in the test score array. Other lines, this is just display the row. So that's what you see right here. So I display the header, student number, test 1, test 2. And then for each student, I display student number 1, test number 1, 85, test number 2, 95, student number 2, test number 1, 78, test number 2, 100, and so on. So you see it show exactly what that table show, and that's what we store. Now, the next question you ask is, how do I pass this 2-dimensional array to a function? printing them in the main program where you have the array itself. Declare right here, that's easy. How do we pass this array to a function? From one-dimensional array, it's easy too, right? Because you already learned. So let's take a look at the function prototype to see what it say. The function prototype say the function name is print score. The return type is void. I'm not returning anything. And you notice that the declaration of the parameter, it's a I'm taking test score, but how do you specify this is two-dimensional array? You notice that there are two pair of square bracket. The first one, we don't specify the size, that is the number of rows. The second one, we specify the size, the column. That's how we pass two-dimensional array to a function. And if you look at the function header, that's what it looks like. So we say, I'm taking two-dimensional array, but I don't need to specify the number of rows. I only need to specify the number of columns. And in the loop, well, we know that the number of row is number of student. Otherwise you can still pass two-dimensional array, and then you may need to pass in another parameter, say the number of row. The number of column is right here, you get it. So you got it in the parameter, so you don't have to pass it into parameter. But if you want, you can pass the number of row into the parameter. However, in this case, we say we're gonna use the two constant, the number of row for student, number of test for a column. And look at this code. It's almost, or it is identical to the code you have in the main functions. So it should be the same. The only difference is when you pass to the function from the main program, you just give the two-dimensional array variable name, the test score, right? In the function, you have to declare the column size, not the size of, not the number of rows, but you must specify the number of columns. That's all. So number of column here is test. So I'm using, instead of say number 2, I just say test because test is my constant over here. So I don't need to say 2, right? And you look at the code, it's the same. So it's not a surprise that the output is exactly the same from the function as from the main program, from main functions over here, because it's the same code. We just do it in the function instead of the main program. So the output should look the same. And that's it. That's the end of this video.